On the 18th of May, 1291, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar was carried off the walls of Acre with a crossbow bolt buried under his arm, and when his own knights accused him of abandoning the fight, he is said to have answered, "I am not fleeing, I am dead." His name was William of Beaujeu, and he was right. He died that day, and within hours, the greatest Christian city in the Holy Land was being overrun. Within 2 weeks, Acre was a smoking ruin, deliberately demolished, so that no crusader would ever land there again. And with it ended nearly 2 centuries of European presence in the lands of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Crusades, as an actual fact of armies and cities on the ground in the Levant, ended at Acre. Everything after was a dream that never came back. To understand why the fall of one port city marked the end of an entire era, you have to understand what Acre was and how little was left of the Crusader world by the time the Mamluks came for it. Because the truth is that the Kingdom of Jerusalem by 1291 was a kingdom in name only, a thin strip of coastline with no Jerusalem in it, riddled with feuding factions, defended by men who could barely agree on who was in charge, and propped up by the constant dwindling hope that Europe would send another great crusade that was never quite going to come. Go back to the beginning of the whole adventure. In the year 1099, the armies of the First Crusade, after a brutal march across Anatolia and Syria, stormed Jerusalem and massacred much of its population, and established a string of Latin Christian states along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, the so-called Crusader States. The greatest of these was the Kingdom of Jerusalem. For most of the 12th century, these states survived, sometimes thrived, as a strange transplanted European society in the Levant, holding the holy places, trading, intermarrying, and fighting both their Muslim neighbors and each other. But the holding of Jerusalem itself was always precarious, and in 1187 it ended. The Muslim leader Saladin, who had united Egypt and Syria, crushed the army of the kingdom at the Battle of Hattin and then took Jerusalem back. The Christians held the holy city for 88 years and then lost it. And apart from one brief diplomatic recovery in the next century, they never held it again. And this is where Acre comes in. After Hattin, the Crusader cause looked finished, and then the Third Crusade arrived to save what could be saved. This was the famous one, the Crusade of Richard the Lionheart of England, and Philip Augustus of France and the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who drowned on the way. The central military event of that crusade, from 1189 to 1191, was the Siege of Acre, a long and grinding affair in which the Crusaders besieged the city while themselves being besieged by Saladin's relieving army. Acre fell to the Crusaders in 1191, and from that point on, it became the true capital and the beating heart of what remained of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The kings of Jerusalem could not live in Jerusalem, so they ruled, in practice, from Acre. For 100 years, it was the wealthiest, busiest, most important Christian city in the East. And it was genuinely magnificent and genuinely rich. Acre sat on a promontory with a fine harbor, and it was one of the great trading hubs of the medieval world, the point where the goods of Asia, the spices and silks that came overland and by sea, were transferred onto Italian ships for Europe. The merchant republics of Italy, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa each held their own quarter of the city, with their own churches, warehouses, and laws, effectively states within the city. The great military religious orders had their massive fortified headquarters there. The Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights, each a kind of independent power with its own walls, its own treasury, and its own army of warrior monks. The city was defended by a formidable double ring of walls and towers, recently strengthened, and its population had swollen, perhaps to something like 40,000 people or more, packed with refugees from every other Christian territory that had already fallen. It looked from the outside like a fortress that could hold forever. From the inside, it was a mess. This is the part that gets left out of the heroic version. Acre was not a unified city under a single command. It was a collection of rival factions crammed behind one set of walls, and they hated each other. The Italian communes were commercial competitors who had actually gone to war with one another inside the city. In the middle of the 13th century, Venice and Genoa fought an open conflict in Acre itself, the War of St. Sabas, named for a monastery whose ownership they disputed, and it turned into years of street fighting and naval war that wrecked parts of the city and killed thousands. The military orders were rivals too, the Templars and Hospitallers frequently at odds. The crown of Jerusalem was contested and weak, claimed by distant figures, and the actual king in the final period was Henry II, who was also king of Cyprus and spent most of his time there. There was no single sovereign with the power to make everyone obey. Acre was rich, well-walled, and politically incapable of defending itself in a coordinated way. It was a wealthy house with many quarreling owners and no master of the gate. Meanwhile, across the wall in the Muslim world, a new and far more dangerous power had risen. These were the Mamluks. The word means owned or slave, and the Mamluks were exactly that in origin. Military slaves, boys mostly from the Turkic and Circassian peoples of the steppe, bought young, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood into an elite professional army of cavalry. In Egypt, this slave soldier caste seized power outright in the middle of the 13th century, killing the last of the previous dynasty and establishing the Mamluk Sultanate, a state ruled by and for a self-perpetuating military elite. And the Mamluks were, by any measure, one of the most effective fighting forces of the entire medieval world. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in what is now Israel, the Mamluks did something no one else had managed. They met the seemingly unstoppable Mongols in open battle and beat them decisively, halting the Mongol advance into the Near East. A power that could break the Mongols was not going to be troubled for long by a divided Crusader port. And one Mamluk Sultan in particular set out to finish the Crusader States for good. His name was Baibars, and he became Sultan after Ain Jalut, and he spent his reign systematically dismantling the Christian holdings in the Levant, fortress by fortress. He took Caesarea, he took Arsuf, he took the great inland castle of Safed, he took Antioch in 1268 in a sack so brutal it horrified even contemporaries, with the population massacred or enslaved on a scale that the surviving accounts describe in numbers almost too large to credit. It is worth understanding the method here, because it was not random conquest. The Crusader states were not really held by their cities. They were held by an interlocking system of immense castles, some of the most sophisticated fortifications ever built, garrisoned by the military orders, which could hold out for years, and from which mounted knights could dominate the surrounding country. Baibars and his engineers became experts at taking them. In 1271, he captured the most famous of all, Crac des Chevaliers, the great Hospitaller castle in Syria that had never fallen to assault by a combination of siege engineering, by one account, a forged letter ordering the garrison to surrender. Each castle that fell removed a node from the network, and once the inland strongpoints were gone, the coastal cities were isolated and doomed. Baibars understood that the Crusader states survived on a network of strongholds and on the hope of reinforcement from the sea, and he set about reducing the strongholds one by one. His successors continued the work. The Sultan Qalawun took the county of Tripoli in 1289, wiping out another of the Crusader states and bringing the frontier right up to Acre's door. By the end of the 1280s, Acre was almost the last significant thing left. The writing was very clearly on the wall, and serious people in the city knew it. What turned the threat into the actual end was an atrocity, and it came from the Christian side. In 1290, a fresh band of crusaders arrived from Europe, poorly disciplined men, peasants and townsfolk from northern Italy who had taken the cross in a wave of popular enthusiasm and arrived in Acre spoiling for a fight with the infidel. There was a truce in place at the time between Acre and the Mamluks, and the city was at peace and trading. These newcomers, drunk and zealous and unable to tell friend from enemy, fell upon Muslim merchants and peasants in Acre, people who had come to the city to trade under the protection of the truce, and massacred a number of them. By some accounts, they killed Muslims and even some Eastern Christians indiscriminately, simply for looking foreign. It was a senseless slaughter, and it shattered the truce. The Sultan Qalawun demanded that the city hand over the men responsible for the massacre to be punished. It was, by the standards of the time, a reasonable demand, since the killings had broken a sworn peace. But Acre, true to its divided and feckless nature, could not bring itself to surrender its own Christians to a Muslim sultan, even guilty ones, and refused. Some in the city wanted to comply and were overruled. The leadership offered excuses and half measures. And Kalawun, who had very likely been looking for a pretext to take Acre anyway, now had one that even his own people and the wider world would accept as just. He began preparing for war on a massive scale. He died in late 1290 as the preparations were underway, but he made his son and successor swear to carry the campaign through. That son was Al-Ashraf Khalil, and he meant to keep the oath. In the spring of 1291, he came for Acre. There was one last chance to avert it, and Acre fumbled that too. After Kalawun's death, as Khalil mustered his army, the city sent an embassy to the new sultan to try to negotiate, to apologize for the massacre, to find some accommodation. Khalil, according to the accounts, would not even receive the envoys properly, and had some of them imprisoned. He had inherited his father's oath and his father's overwhelming preparations, and he had no interest in a settlement. The city had passed up the moment when handing over a handful of guilty men might conceivably have bought peace, and now no apology would do. The decision had moved out of Acre's hands entirely. The only question left was how long the walls would hold. The army Khalil brought was enormous, far larger than anything Acre could field, with estimates of the Mamluk forces ranging into the many tens of thousands of soldiers drawn from Egypt and Syria, with contingents from across the Sultanate, and with a vast corps of miners and engineers recruited from the mountains of the region who were the real specialists of the siege. And crucially, he brought a siege train of extraordinary power, scores of mangonels and stone-throwing catapults, including very large ones that the chroniclers record by name. There was a great catapult the Muslims called Al-Mansuri, the Victorious, and others with names like the Furious. These engines were set up to pound specific sections of the wall, and behind them came the real wall breakers of medieval siege warfare. The miners, who dug tunnels under the towers, shored them up with timber, and then burned the timber so that the tunnel collapsed and brought the tower down with it. The siege began in early April 1291. The shape of the defenses matters for understanding how the siege unfolded. Acre had grown beyond its original walls into a second-walled district to the north, the suburb of Montmassard, so the city was protected by a long double line of walls, an outer and an inner wall studded with towers, running in a great arc around the landward side while the sea protected the rest. The towers along this circuit had names: the King's Tower, the Tower of the Countess of Blois, the English Tower, and the great salient known as the Accursed Tower, at the angle where the defenses were most exposed. And it was against this corner that the Mamluks concentrated much of their effort. Different sections of the wall were assigned to different contingents: the military orders, the communes, the king's men, each defending its own stretch. This was sensible, but it also reflected the city's fractured command. There was coordination in the defense, but it was the coordination of allies who did not fully trust one another, each holding its own ground, rather than of a single army under one will. Against a besieger who could mass his catapults and miners against any single tower he chose, a wall defended in separate sectors by mutually suspicious factions had a fatal weakness, and the Mamluks found it. The defenders fought hard, and they were not without skill. The garrison included the warrior monks of the military orders, the Templars under William of Beaujeu, the Hospitallers under their Grand Master John of Villiers, the Teutonic Knights, the troops of the Italian communes, French royal soldiers left behind from an earlier expedition, and a contingent under a distinguished Savoyard knight named Otto of Grandson. King Henry II arrived by ship from Cyprus in early May with reinforcements, which briefly lifted morale, but the numbers were still hopelessly against the city. The total of fighting men available to the defense was perhaps 14 or 15,000 at most, against a Mamluk army several times that size, and the defenders had to man a long circuit of walls while the attackers could concentrate against any point they chose. The fighting was savage and went on for weeks. The Mamluk catapults battered the towers day and night while the miners dug steadily forward beneath them. The defenders mounted sorties to try to destroy the siege engines and fill in the saps. One famous night, sortie by the Templars, meant to fall on the enemy camp by surprise, went wrong in the dark, when the knights' horses became tangled in the guy ropes of the Mamluk tents, and the men were caught and driven back with losses. As the days passed, the great towers of the outer wall began to fail under the combined pounding of the catapults and the undermining the tower of the Countess of Blois, the King's Tower, and above all, the great tower known as the Accursed Tower, a key point in the defenses, were battered and undermined until they cracked and crumbled. The Mamluks pressed into the gaps, and the defenders fought to throw them back from the breaches with everything they had. The decisive day was the 18th of May, 1291. At dawn, to the sound of drums and trumpets, the Mamluks launched a general assault all along the battered walls, throwing their full weight against the breaches, especially around the accursed tower. The defenders held desperately, and it was here, rallying his Templars to plug a gap near the St. Anthony Gate, that William of Beaujeu, the Grand Master, was struck. A javelin or crossbow bolt went in under his raised arm, through the gap in his armor, and lodged deep. He turned to ride away, and his knights, not seeing the wound, cried out that he was deserting them. That is when he gave the answer that survived him. I am not fleeing, I am dead. And he was carried off to the Templar fortress, where he died. With the Grand Master down and the walls breached in several places, the defense collapsed into chaos. The Mamluks poured into the city, and the fighting dissolved into a massacre and a desperate, panicked scramble for the harbor. The only escape was by sea, and there were nowhere near enough ships. Tens of thousands of people, soldiers, women, children, clergy, the wealthy and the poor, crowded down to the docks, fighting for a place on any vessel that could float. Boats were swamped and overturned by the sheer press of people. There is a grim, well-attested story of the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Nicholas, an old man, who was got onto a boat and then, refusing to turn away the desperate people swimming and clutching at it, let so many aboard that the overloaded boat capsized, and he drowned with all of them. The Italian merchants who controlled the ships made fortunes in those hours selling passage to the rich at extortionate prices, while the poor were left on the shore. King Henry and the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, John of Villiers, who was himself badly wounded, were among those evacuated to Cyprus. Most of the people of Acre were not. But the city was not quite finished. When the main assault overran Acre, a body of Templars and refugees fell back into the great fortified compound of the Temple, the Templar headquarters, which stood on the seaward corner of the city and was the strongest single fortress in Acre, with its walls washed by the sea on one side, so that it could be partly supplied by ship. There, under the Templar Marshal, Peter of Sèvres, the last defenders held out for another 10 days or so after the city itself had fallen. Sultan Khalil offered them terms, safe passage in exchange for surrender, and the Templars agreed and admitted a party of Mamluk soldiers to take possession. But some of those soldiers began molesting the women and boys among the refugees, and the enraged Templars fell on them and killed them, and the truce collapsed. A second attempt at negotiation ended in treachery, with the marshal and others seized and beheaded outside the walls. The remaining defenders fought on, knowing they were doomed. The end of the temple came as the Mamluk miners did their work one last time. They had undermined the great seaward tower of the Templar fortress, and when its props were burned, the huge structure collapsed. By the accounts, it fell partly outward as the Mamluk assault troops rushed in to storm it, so that the collapsing masonry crushed attackers and defenders together in one great ruin, hundreds of men on both sides killed in the fall of the tower. By around the 28th of May, 1291, it was over. Acre had fallen completely. And then the Mamluks did something that made the fall permanent. Sultan Khalil ordered Acre razed. The walls were thrown down, the harbor wrecked, the buildings demolished. And this was not the rage of a single sack. It was deliberate strategic policy, and the Mamluks applied it all along the coast. They understood that the Crusader States had always lived by the sea, that Crusaders came by ship and held the coastal cities as beachheads from which to project power inland and to which reinforcements could be landed. So the Mamluks resolved to destroy the coast as a usable base. In the weeks and months after Acre, the remaining Christian-held coastal towns fell or were abandoned in quick succession. Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, Haifa, the great Templar castle at Atlit known as Chateau Pèlerin, and Tortosa. Many of them were not even seriously defended. With Acre gone, there was no point. And the Mamluks methodically demolished the fortifications and harbors of these cities so that no future crusade could simply sail in and seize a fortified port. They made the coastline indefensible on purpose, and in doing so, they closed the door on the entire crusading enterprise in the Holy Land. The Christians had come by sea, and the Mamluks took the sea gates away. The human cost of the fall was staggering and is worth stating plainly rather than leaving as a number. Of the tens of thousands trapped in Acre, those who did not escape by sea were killed or enslaved. The accounts describe the slave markets of Damascus afterward so glutted with captives from Acre, women and children especially, that the price of a slave collapsed, a girl reportedly selling for a trivial sum because the supply was so enormous. Families were separated and scattered across the Islamic world. The clergy and the fighting men were largely killed outright. For a city that had been the richest in the Latin East, packed with merchants and refugees, the reckoning was total. The wealth that had made Acre famous, the warehouses of spice and silk, was plundered, and the people who had generated it were dead, fled, or sold. This was not an unusual fate for a stormed medieval city that had refused terms. But the scale at Acre, because of how many had crowded into it as the last refuge, made it one of the great human catastrophes of the age. And Europe did not come. This is the quiet, damning fact behind the whole final act. The Crusader States had survived for 2 centuries on the periodic arrival of armies and money from the West, and by 1291, that lifeline had effectively dried up. The kings of Europe were absorbed in their own wars, England and France circling each other, the Holy Roman Empire in disorder, and the crusading fervor that had once thrown tens of thousands of men at Jerusalem had cooled into talk, taxation, and good intentions. The Pope, Nicholas IV, did try to raise help after the danger became clear, but the response was thin and far too slow. The relief that reached Acre amounted to a few hundred fighting men and the soldiers King Henry brought from nearby Cyprus against a Mamluk army of tens of thousands. The truth is that Latin Christendom had quietly given up on the Holy Land before the Holy Land fell. Acre did not lose because Europe tried and failed to save it. Acre lost because Europe, by 1291, was no longer really trying. That was the end of the Crusader States. From the fall of Jerusalem to the First Crusade in 1099 to the fall of Acre in 1291, the Latin Christian presence in the Holy Land had lasted just shy of 2 centuries, and now it was simply gone. There would be talk of new crusades for a long time afterward, plans drawn up, taxes levied, vows taken, but no major crusade ever again established itself in the Levant. The dream of recovering Jerusalem persisted in European imagination for centuries, but the reality on the ground was finished in 1291. The survivors regrouped on the island of Cyprus, where the kings of Jerusalem now reigned over a kingdom that no longer touched the mainland it was named for. The fall of Acre also reshaped the great military orders, with consequences that ran on for decades. The Knights Hospitaller relocated and reinvented themselves, eventually seizing the island of Rhodes and becoming a naval power, the Knights of Rhodes, and later of Malta, who would fight the Ottomans for centuries. The Teutonic Knights shifted their energies north to the Baltic, where they carved out a crusading state against the pagan peoples of the region. And the Knights Templar, the most famous of all, withdrew to Cyprus. But having lost the Holy Land, that was their entire reason to exist, they lost their purpose and much of their prestige, and within a generation, the King of France and the Pope moved against them. In 1307, the Templars were arrested en masse on charges of heresy, tortured into confessions, and in 1312, the order was suppressed, its last Grand Master burned at the stake a couple of years later. The fall of Acre did not destroy the Templars directly, but it knocked away the ground they stood on, and they did not survive long without it. We know the story of the siege in unusual detail, and it is worth naming the witnesses, because they sat on both sides of the wall. The fullest Christian account comes from an anonymous writer known as the Templar of Tyre, who was in the city attached to the household of William of Beaujeu himself, and whose chronicle preserves the close detail of the defense, including the Grand Master's death and his last words. On the Muslim side, one of the soldiers in the besieging army was a young prince and gifted historian named Abu al-Fida, who later became the ruler of the city of Hama and who wrote about the campaign he had personally taken part in. Between the chronicle of the man inside the doomed city and the memoir of the prince and the army storming it, we can reconstruct the Fall of Acre more vividly than almost any other event of its kind in the period. So what fell at Acre in the end? Not just a city and not just an army. What fell was the last foothold of a 200-year project, and it fell for reasons that were written into it from the start. Acre was rich, well-walled, and impossible to govern. A city of merchants and warrior monks and rival communes who could not unite even with annihilation staring at them, who broke a truce through the stupidity of a mob and then would not face the consequences, who in the final hours sold seats on the lifeboats to the highest bidder. Against that stood the Mamluks, a disciplined, unified, professional war machine that had already broken the Mongols and had spent 30 years patiently dismantling everything around Acre, and that understood exactly what it needed to do to make the victory permanent, which was to destroy not just the city, but the entire shoreline that made crusading possible. William of Beaujeu's last words have lasted 700 years because they are, in a way, the epitaph of the whole enterprise. I am not fleeing, I am dead. The Crusader kingdom did not run from the Holy Land. It died there on a May morning at Acre, with its Grand Master carried bleeding from the wall. And the Mamluks tore down the walls and wrecked the harbors of the whole coast so that it could never come back, and never even came back to be buried.